The winter of 1887 brought more than snow to the Dakota Territory. It brought secrets that would challenge everything the town of Cedar Falls thought it knew about survival, love, and second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 17-year-old Marlena Walsh pressed her back against the cold limestone wall, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid cave air. Her hands instinctively moved to her growing belly, feeling the life stirring within. 6 months now, and still no one knew where she had gone. The town believed she had simply vanished after that terrible night when her father discovered her condition and threw her into the streets with nothing but the clothes on her back. But Marlena hadn't vanished. She had found refuge in the most unlikely place, a network of caves carved into the hillside 3 miles outside town, hidden behind a curtain of twisted juniper trees. What the townspeople didn't know was that these caves held more than just a frightened girl. They held a story that would soon change everything. The autumn leaves had barely begun their descent when Marlena's world collapsed. Her father, Jeremiah Walsh, was known throughout Cedar Falls as a stern man who ran the town's only bank with an iron fist. His reputation was everything to him, more important than family, more important than forgiveness, and certainly more important than understanding. When Marlena had worked up the courage to tell him about her condition, standing in his oak-paneled office after the bank had closed, his reaction was swift and merciless. The young man responsible had already fled town, leaving behind only whispered rumors and Marlena's shattered trust. Her father's words that evening cut deeper than any winter. "Wind, you've brought shame to this family name," he had said, his voice eerily calm. "I won't have a bastard child living under my roof, and I won't have the town seeing my daughter's mistake every day." By dawn, Marlena found herself walking the dusty road out of Cedar Falls with only a small bundle of belongings and $17 she had saved from helping at the general store. The morning mist clung to the prairie grass as she made her way toward the hills, not knowing where she was going, only that she couldn't turn back. The caves had been discovered by accident. Exhausted and desperate for shelter as the first autumn storm rolled across the territory, Marlena had sought refuge behind what appeared to be a wall of thick brush. Instead, she found herself stumbling into a natural corridor carved into the limestone bluff. The main chamber was larger than her father's office, with smaller alcoves branching off like rooms in a house. Centuries of wind and water had created smooth walls and natural shelves. Most remarkably, a small underground spring provided fresh water, bubbling up from deep within the earth. In those first weeks, Marlena survived on wild berries, roots she remembered her grandmother teaching her to identify, and the occasional rabbit she managed to trap. The cave stayed surprisingly warm, protected from the prairie winds and insulated by the thick rock walls. She fashioned a bed from pine boughs and learned to build small, smokeless fires using dried grass and twigs. As autumn deepened into winter, Marlena developed routines that kept her both alive and sane. She would venture out before dawn to gather what food she could find, always careful to avoid the main roads where someone from town might spot her. During the long winter days, she organized her small space, carved improvements into the cave walls, and talked to the child growing inside her. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Marlena had always been surrounded by customers at her father's bank, friends from church, the bustling activity of a frontier town. Now her only companions were the occasional deer that came to drink from the spring and the owls that nested in the higher chambers of the cave system. But solitude also brought unexpected gifts. For the first time in her life, Marlena was free to think her own thoughts without her father's disapproval or the town's expectations weighing on her decisions. She discovered she had a talent for identifying edible plants and a surprising ability to improve her living conditions with creativity and determination. The scared girl who had fled Cedar Falls was slowly transforming into someone stronger. Winter tested every skill she had developed. Food became scarce, and the bitter cold made foraging dangerous. There were nights when the temperature dropped so low that even the protected spring showed thin films of ice. Marlena learned to preserve what little meat she could catch, smoking it over carefully tended fires deep within the cave where the smoke would dissipate through natural vents. During the worst blizzards, she would retreat to the deepest chamber, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, talking to her unborn child about the world they would face together. She made plans for spring, imagining how she would teach the baby to identify safe plants, how they would build a better shelter, how they might even create a small garden in the protected valley below the caves. The baby became more active as winter progressed, kicking and turning in response to Marlena's voice. She would sing the old songs her grandmother had taught her, Irish ballads and frontier hymns that echoed beautifully in the limestone chambers. Sometimes she imagined the baby was dancing to the music, and despite everything, these moments brought her genuine joy. As February gave way to March, Marlena began to face a frightening reality. The baby would come soon, and she would be completely alone. She had no medical knowledge beyond the basics her mother had taught her before her death 5 years earlier. There were no midwives in the caves, no doctor she could call, no women to help her through the most dangerous experience of her life. She began gathering supplies, clean cloth torn from her few spare garments, sharp stones she had carefully shaped containers for water. She practiced breathing techniques she remembered hearing described, and she prayed to whatever power might be listening in the vast silence of the cave. The first signs of spring brought new challenges. The snow began melting, creating treacherous conditions on the slopes around the cave entrance. The winter's accumulated debris needed clearing. Most concerning, Marlena's movements were becoming increasingly difficult as her pregnancy progressed. Tasks that had become routine were now exhausting efforts. It was during one of these early spring days, as Marlena struggled to gather firewood near the cave entrance, that she first encountered the rider. She had been careless, venturing out during daylight hours when she thought the remote location made discovery impossible. The sound of hoofbeats on the rocky trail below sent her scrambling for cover, but not before the horseman had spotted movement among the trees. From her hiding place behind a boulder, Marlena watched as a tall man dismounted and studied the ground where she had been walking. He was older than the boy she had known in town, probably in his 30s, with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. His horse was well cared for, but practical rather than fancy, suggesting he was working rancher rather than a wealthy landowner. The man stood perfectly still for several minutes, clearly aware that someone was nearby but making no aggressive moves. Finally, he remounted his horse and continued up the trail, but not before leaving a small bundle tied to a tree branch. Jerky, hardtack, and dried fruit wrapped in clean cloth. Marlena waited until long after the hoofbeats had faded before retrieving the gift. Along with the food was a brief note written in careful handwriting. "These hills can be dangerous. If you need help, there's a ranch 5 miles south of here. Follow the creek." That night, as Marlena shared the unexpected bounty with her unborn child, she faced a decision that would change everything. For months, she had survived through her own determination and resourcefulness, proving to herself that she was stronger than anyone had believed. But the approaching birth meant she could no longer rely solely on her own strength. The question was whether she could trust a stranger's kindness, or if doing so would destroy the sanctuary she had created in these limestone walls. The answer would come sooner than she expected, and it would test everything she thought she knew about human nature, survival, and the possibility of finding family in the most unexpected places. As spring rain began to fall on the prairie outside, washing away the last remnants of winter, Marlena felt the first unmistakable signs that her child was ready to enter the world. The choice between isolation and trust was about to be made for her. The contractions began at dawn, 3 days after the mysterious rider had left his gift. Marlena had experienced false alarms before, but these were different, deeper, more insistent, following a rhythm that seemed to sync with her heartbeat. She moved carefully through her morning routine, boiling water from the spring and arranging the supplies she had gathered, trying to push down the growing panic that threatened to overwhelm her. By midday, the pain had intensified beyond anything she could have imagined. Between contractions, she found herself thinking about the note the stranger had left, 5 miles south, following the creek. The distance seemed impossible now, but as another wave of pain crashed over her, Marlena realized she might not have a choice. She managed to pack a small bundle with her most essential items, the last of her food, a blanket, and the money she had hoarded through the long winter months. Each movement was agony, but fear drove her forward. Stories of women dying in childbirth were common on the frontier, and she refused to let her child's first breath also be its last. The journey down from the caves nearly killed her. What had been a manageable climb in her earlier pregnancy became a nightmare of slipping stones and desperate rest stops. She followed game trails when she could find them, using trees and rocks for support as the contractions grew stronger and closer together. The creek was her lifeline, both for direction and for the cool water that helped her fight through the waves of pain. Thomas Brennan was checking his southern fence line when he heard the cry. At first he thought it might be an injured animal, a sound of pure desperation carried on the wind. His horse's ears pricked forward, and Thomas followed the sound to a grove of cottonwoods near the creek where he found a young woman collapsed among the fallen leaves. She was clearly in the final stages of labor, her clothes torn from the journey, her face streaked with dirt and tears. But what struck Thomas most was her eyes, fierce and determined even through the pain, like a wounded hawk that would fight to the last breath. This wasn't someone who had given up, despite whatever circumstances had brought her to his land. "Ma'am," he said softly, dismounting slowly so as not to startle her. "I'm Thomas Brennan. This is my ranch. Can you tell me your name?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Marlena," she gasped between contractions. "The baby ... it's coming now." Thomas had assisted with difficult births before, but always with cattle or horses, never with a human being. Still, the principles were the same: stay calm, keep everything clean, and help nature take its course. He quickly unsaddled his horse and used the blanket to create a makeshift shelter, then sent the animal back toward the ranch house with a sharp whistle, a signal his foreman would recognize as urgent. The birth was unlike anything in Thomas's experience. This young woman, barely more than a girl, showed strength that would have impressed seasoned ranch hands. She followed his calm instructions, gripped his hands when the pain became unbearable, and never once asked him to judge her situation or explain how she had come to be giving birth alone in the wilderness. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy boy with powerful lungs, Thomas felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't expected. He had lived alone for 8 years since his wife's death, convinced that his capacity for family had died with her. But as he placed the crying infant in Marlena's arms and watched her face transform with wonder and relief, he realized that some wounds could heal in ways he had never imagined. "He's perfect," Marlena whispered, her voice hoarse from effort, but filled with absolute love. "He's a fighter, like his mother," Thomas replied, and meant it completely. The foreman arrived with a wagon and 2 ranch hands just as Thomas was helping Marlena get settled for the journey to the main house. If the men were surprised to find their boss delivering a baby to a stranger, they gave no sign of it. The frontier taught people not to ask too many questions about circumstances beyond someone's control. The Brennan ranch house had been built to shelter a large family, though it had housed only Thomas for nearly a decade. The main bedroom was converted into a temporary nursery, with Marlena and the baby settling into a space that felt impossibly luxurious after months in the cave. Clean sheets, a real mattress, windows that let in natural light, simple comforts. That felt like miracles. Thomas's housekeeper, Maria Santos, had worked for the family since before his wife's death. A woman of perhaps 50 with gentle hands and practical wisdom. She took one look at Marlena and the baby and immediately began organizing care. Hot meals appeared regularly, clean clothes were provided without question, and the infant was pronounced healthy and strong after Maria's thorough examination. "She has been through much," Maria told Thomas quietly that first evening, "but she is not broken. This one will heal." During those first weeks, Thomas found himself taking longer routes past the main house, checking on details that didn't really need his attention. He told himself he was simply being a responsible host, ensuring his guests had everything they needed. But the truth was more complicated. Marlena's presence had awakened something in the house that had been dormant since his wife's death. There were sounds again, a baby's cries, a woman's laughter, conversations at the dinner table. The rooms that had felt like a mausoleum began to feel like a home. Marlena, for her part, threw herself into useful work as soon as she was physically able. She helped Maria with household tasks, learned to prepare meals for the ranch hands, and organized supplies with an efficiency that impressed everyone. She never acted like a charity case or a burden, instead finding ways to contribute that made her presence feel natural and necessary. The baby, named Samuel after Marlena's grandfather, became the unofficial mascot of the ranch. The hardest cowboys would stop their work to peek at him, and more than one tough ranch hand was caught making silly faces to earn a baby's smile. Samuel seemed to sense he was surrounded by people who wanted him safe and happy, sleeping peacefully, and growing stronger each day. As spring moved toward summer, Thomas began teaching Marlena practical skills she would need for ranch life: how to identify safe versus dangerous snakes, how to read weather patterns, how to handle the large dogs that guarded the property. She learned with the same determination she had shown in surviving the winter, asking intelligent questions and practicing until she mastered each new skill. Their conversations, at first focused on practical matters, gradually became deeper. Thomas learned about Marlena's childhood, her love of reading, her dreams of maybe teaching school someday. Marlena discovered that Thomas had been to college back east, that he wrote letters to agricultural journals, that he had chosen ranch life not because it was all he knew, but because it was what he loved. Neither of them spoke about the future directly, but both were aware of the growing connection between them. Thomas found himself looking forward to dinner conversations and evening walks when Samuel was sleeping peacefully. Marlena caught herself studying Thomas's face during these quiet moments, noting his kindness, his intelligence, his gentle way of treating both animals and people. The turning point came during a violent thunderstorm in early June. Samuel had been fussy all day, and the approaching weather made everyone nervous. When lightning began striking close to the ranch buildings, Marlena instinctively moved toward Thomas's room, seeking the comfort of company. During the frightening display of nature's power, they found themselves sitting together in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside while Samuel slept peacefully between them. Without planning it, they began talking about their fears, their hopes, the strange circumstances that had brought them together. "I never expected to feel safe again," Marlena admitted quietly. "After everything that happened, I thought trust was something I had lost forever." "I never expected to feel alive again," Thomas replied. "I thought my heart had been buried with my wife." The storm passed, but something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer host and guest, no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were two people who had found something precious in each other, something worth building a future around. The first test of their newfound understanding came from an unexpected source. Cedar Falls had not forgotten Marlena Walsh. and her disappearance had sparked rumors that grew more elaborate with each passing month. Some claimed she had died in the wilderness. Others whispered that she had run off with a traveling merchant. Her father, Jeremiah, had told anyone who asked that his daughter was visiting relatives back east, but his increasingly haggard appearance suggested the lie was taking its toll. It was Benjamin Clark, the town's blacksmith and notorious gossip, who finally connected the dots. He had been shoeing horses at the Brennan Ranch when he noticed a young woman hanging laundry behind the main house. Something about her profile seemed familiar, and when she turned to speak to the baby in her arms, Benjamin's suspicions crystallized into certainty. By the time he returned to Cedar Falls, the story had grown in his telling. Marlena Walsh wasn't just alive, she was living in sin with Thomas Brennan, flaunting her illegitimate child for all to see. The scandal was exactly the kind of tale that spread like wildfire through small frontier communities, growing more sensational with each retelling. Jerry Walsh received the news while reviewing loan applications in his office. His first reaction was relief his daughter was alive. His second was rage. In his mind, Marlena had not only disgraced herself, but had now compounded that disgrace by becoming the kept woman of a man she barely knew. The fact that Thomas Brennan was respected throughout the territory meant nothing to Jeremiah. His daughter's behavior reflected on the Walsh family name, and that was all that mattered. He arrived at the Brennan Ranch on a sweltering July morning, accompanied by Sheriff Morrison and 2 other men from town. Thomas was working with a difficult horse in the main corral when the riders approached, and he recognized trouble in their formation and bearing before they had even dismounted. "Mr. Brennan," Jeremiah announced without preamble, "I've come for my daughter." Marlena emerged from the house at the sound of voices, Samuel in her arms. The sight of her father after all these months hit her like a physical blow. He looked older, grayer, but his eyes held the same cold disapproval that had driven her from his house 9 months earlier. "Hello, Father," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "You will gather your things and return to town immediately," Jeremiah declared. "This arrangement has gone on long enough." Thomas stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between Jeremiah and Marlena. "Miss Walsh is a guest on my ranch. She's free to make her own decisions about where she lives and with whom." "She is my daughter and a minor," Jeremiah shot back. "I have every legal right to take her home." Sheriff Morrison, a decent man who had known both families for years, looked uncomfortable with his role in the confrontation. "Marlena," he said gently, "you are still 17. Legally, your father does have authority over your decisions." Marlena looked at Thomas, then at her father, then down at Samuel, who was beginning to fuss at the tension in the air. For months she had dreaded this moment, knowing it would eventually come but hoping it might be delayed until she was legally an adult. Now she faced a choice that would determine not just her future, but the future of her son and the man who had shown them both such unexpected kindness. "What kind of life are you offering me, Father?" she asked, surprising everyone. With the strength in her voice, "Will you welcome Samuel? Will you help me raise him? Will you acknowledge him as your grandson?" Jeremiah's silence was answer enough, but he eventually spoke the words aloud. "That child is evidence of your shame. I will not have him in my house." "Then I will not come to your house," Marlena replied. "I am 17, but I am also a mother. My first responsibility is to my son, not to your reputation." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Thomas stepped forward with a solution that stunned everyone present. "Mr. Walsh," he said formally, "I would like to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." The silence that followed was deafening. Marlena stared at Thomas in shock. Sheriff Morrison's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline, and Jeremiah's face cycled through several shades of red and purple. "You cannot be serious," Jeremiah finally sputtered. "I am completely serious," Thomas replied calmly. "I have come to care deeply for both Marlena and Samuel. I can provide for them, protect them, and give them a good life. If she will have me, I would be honored to make her my wife." Thomas turned to Marlena, his eyes gentle but determined. "You don't have to answer now, but I want you to know that the offer is real, and it comes from my heart." Marlena felt tears starting to form, but they were not tears of sadness. For the first time since she had told her father about her pregnancy, someone was offering her a choice based on love rather than shame, hope rather than fear. "I need time to think," she said softly. "Of course," Thomas nodded. "Take all the time you need." Jeremiah was not prepared to accept such a development. In his mind, this was merely another example of his daughter's poor judgment and moral weakness. He began to speak about family duty, community standards, and the proper way for young women to conduct themselves. But his words seemed to bounce off the bubble of understanding that had formed around Thomas and Marlena. Sheriff Morrison finally ended the confrontation by pointing out that no laws were being broken. Marlena was being well cared for, she was not being held against her will, and Thomas's marriage proposal had been made publicly and honorably. There were no grounds for forcing her to leave, especially not when she had stated clearly that she preferred to remain. After the men from town had departed, Thomas and Marlena walked to the creek where Samuel had been born. The baby dozed peacefully in his mother's arms while they sat on a fallen log and tried to process what had just happened. "Did you mean what you said?" Marlena asked quietly. "Every word," Thomas replied. "But I don't want you to feel pressured. You've been through enough situations where other people tried to control your choices. What would marriage mean for Samuel? It would mean he has a father who loves him and will raise him as his own son. It would mean he never has to wonder whether he belongs in this family." Marlena was quiet for a long time, watching the water flow past their feet. "I care for you, Thomas, more than I thought possible. But I don't want you to marry me just to solve a problem." "I'm not," he said firmly. "I'm asking you to marry me because I can't imagine my life without you and Samuel in it. These past months have shown me what happiness feels like again." That evening, Marlena sought out Maria Santos, who had become both confidant and surrogate mother during her time at the ranch. They sat in the kitchen while Samuel played with wooden spoons on the floor, and Marlena poured out her confusion and fears. "Love is not always convenient," Maria said wisely. "Sometimes it comes when we least expect it, with people we never planned to meet. The question is not whether it is the right time, but whether it is the right person." "How do I know if Thomas is the right person?" "You watch how he treats you when he thinks no one is looking. You see how he responds when things are difficult. You notice whether he makes you feel stronger or weaker, braver or more afraid." As Marlena thought about Thomas's behavior over the past months, the answer became clear. He had never tried to control her decisions or make her feel ashamed of her past. He had encouraged her independence while offering support. He had treated Samuel not as a burden to be tolerated, but as a gift to be treasured. The next morning, she found Thomas in the barn, grooming his favorite mare. Samuel was with her, gurgling happily from his basket, and Thomas immediately smiled at both of them, the automatic, genuine smile of a man who was truly happy to see the people he loved. "I have an answer to your question," Marlena said. Thomas set down his brush and gave her his full attention. "Yes," she said simply, "I would be honored to be your wife." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the parlor of the ranch house, officiated by the circuit preacher who traveled through the territory monthly. Maria Santos served as matron of honor, and Thomas's foreman, Jack Riley, stood as best man. Samuel, now 4 months old and growing more alert each day, seemed to sense the importance of the occasion and remained unusually quiet throughout the ceremony. Most of Cedar Falls was scandalized by the marriage, viewing it as Thomas's misguided attempt to make an honest woman of his mistress. But those who knew Thomas best as ranch hands, his neighbors, The merchants he dealt with honestly recognized something different in his demeanor. He had the contentment of a man who had found his heart's desire rather than the resignation of someone making the best of a bad situation. Jeremiah Walsh refused to attend the wedding or acknowledge his daughter's new status. To him, Marlena remained a source of shame who had now compounded her disgrace by tricking a respected rancher into marriage. He told anyone who would listen that Thomas Brennan had been taken advantage of by a scheming girl who used her illegitimate child to trap a wealthy man, but the evidence of the marriage's authenticity was visible to anyone who spent time around the new family. Thomas treated Marlena not as a rescued charity case, but as a true partner. He sought her opinions on ranch decisions, encouraged her to pursue her interest in teaching by ordering books from Denver, and clearly delighted in her company during their evening walks and quiet conversations. The transformation was perhaps most evident in Samuel. Under Thomas's loving attention, the baby flourished in ways that went beyond simple physical health. He laughed more readily, reached developmental milestones early, and seemed to radiate the confidence that came from being genuinely wanted and loved. Thomas spent hours each evening playing with Samuel, reading to him, and teaching him to recognize the sounds of different animals around the ranch. As autumn arrived and the first anniversary of Marlena's flight from Cedar Falls approached, she found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. The frightened, desperate girl who had sought shelter in the caves seemed like a different person entirely. She had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed, learned to trust her own judgment, and found a love deeper and more genuine than anything she had imagined possible. The cave that had sheltered her through that terrible winter became a place she visited occasionally, not out of nostalgia but out of gratitude. It reminded her that she was capable of surviving anything, that she could trust her own resilience, and that sometimes the most difficult paths led to the most beautiful destinations. Thomas often accompanied her on these visits, marveling at the ingenuity she had shown in creating a livable space from such primitive conditions. He never expressed pity for what she had endured, only admiration for how she had endured it. To him, the cave was evidence not of Marlena's desperation, but of her remarkable capability. As they stood together at the cave entrance, one crisp October day, Samuel bundled warmly in Marlena's arms. Thomas voiced what they had both been thinking. "You saved yourself," he said quietly. "Long before I found you, you had already chosen to fight for your life and Samuel's life. I was just lucky enough to be in the right place when you were ready to trust someone else." Marlena smiled, remembering the terrified girl who had first stumbled into these limestone chambers. "I survived," she corrected. "We saved each other." The sound of Samuel's happy babbling echoed off the cave walls, a joyful noise that seemed to bless the place that had sheltered his first months of life. Soon they would need to head back to the ranch where a warm dinner and comfortable beds awaited them. But for now, they stood together at the threshold between past and future, grateful for the journey that had brought them to this moment of complete contentment. Winter returned to the Dakota Territory with unusual ferocity that year, bringing blizzards that isolated the Brennan Ranch for weeks at a time. But unlike the previous winter when Marlena had faced the cold alone and frightened, this season brought challenges that only strengthened the bonds of the family she had found. The harsh weather tested every aspect of ranch life. Cattle needed constant attention to prevent them from freezing. Water sources required daily breaking of ice, and the house demanded enormous amounts of firewood to stay warm. Marlena threw herself into these tasks with an enthusiasm that surprised even Thomas. She learned to milk cows in sub-zero temperatures, to recognize the signs of frostbite in livestock, and to prepare the hearty meals that kept the ranch hands working through the bitter cold. Samuel, now 8 months old, had grown into a robust baby who seemed utterly unfazed by the extreme weather. He had taken his first steps during a December blizzard tottering across the kitchen floor while wind howled outside. Thomas had been more excited than Marlena about this milestone, immediately beginning to plan for all the adventures he would share with his adopted son once the weather improved. But the isolation of winter also brought unexpected visitors. In January, during a brief break in the storms, a wagon train of settlers appeared at the ranch, seeking shelter and supplies. They were bound for Oregon, but had been caught unprepared by the severity of the winter. Among them was a young widow named Catherine Mueller with 3 small children. Traveling alone after her husband's death from pneumonia, Marlena immediately recognized the desperation in Catherine's eyes, the same fear and uncertainty she had felt during her own darkest moments. Without consulting Thomas, she invited Catherine and her children to stay in the ranch house until spring, an offer that Thomas supported without hesitation. The presence of other children transformed the ranch house into something resembling a frontier school. 8-year-old Hans Mueller was old enough to help with simple chores, while his sisters, 5-year-old Emma and 3-year-old Greta, brought laughter and energy that brightened even the coldest days. Marlena found herself naturally taking on the role of teacher, organizing lessons in reading and arithmetic that kept the children occupied during the long indoor hours. Catherine proved to be a skilled seamstress and an excellent cook, contributions that were desperately needed as the household had suddenly doubled in size. More importantly, she provided Marlena with the first real friendship she had known since leaving Cedar Falls. The 2 women spent evening hours together, sharing stories of their different paths to the frontier while mending clothes and planning meals for the following day. "You have built something remarkable here," Catherine told Marlena one snowy evening as they watched their children play together near the fireplace. "I can see why you chose to stay." "I didn't choose at first," Marlena admitted. "I was running away from something rather than running toward something. But Thomas and this place helped me understand the difference." As winter progressed, word of the Brennan Ranch's hospitality spread among the settler communities. Other families found their way to the ranch seeking shelter, supplies, or simply human companionship during the harsh months. Thomas never turned anyone away, and Marlena became the unofficial hostess for a constantly changing population of travelers, each with their own stories of hardship and hope. The most challenging guests arrived in February, a family named Peterson whose wagon had broken down 20 miles from the ranch. The father, Nils Peterson, had injured his back trying to repair the wagon, leaving his pregnant wife Astrid to care for their 4 young children while walking through deep snow to seek help. Marlena took one look at Astrid Peterson, exhausted, frightened, and clearly in the early stages of labor, and immediately took charge. She organized the ranch hands to rescue the stranded wagon and belongings, while she prepared the guest bedroom for another birth. This time, however, she was not alone and terrified. She had experience, assistance, and the confidence that came from having successfully navigated such challenges before. Astrid's labor was difficult, complicated by her exhaustion and the stress of their circumstances. But with Maria Santos providing medical knowledge, Thomas handling practical arrangements, and Marlena offering emotional support, the birth proceeded safely. Baby Eric Peterson entered the world during a howling blizzard, his cries almost lost in the wind, but clearly audible to everyone who had worked to ensure his safe arrival. The experience of helping deliver Eric awakened something new in Marlena, a calling she had never considered before. She realized that her own difficult experiences had given her unique insights into helping other women through similar challenges. She began to study the medical books in Thomas's library, learning everything she could about childbirth, infant care, and frontier medicine. "I think I want to become a midwife," she told Thomas one evening as they sat together planning the spring planting. "There are so many women out here who face childbirth alone, just like I did. Maybe I could help them." Thomas's face lit up with pride and admiration. "You would be extraordinary at that work. You have the knowledge, the compassion, and the strength to help women through their most difficult moments. Spring's arrival brought both departures and new beginnings. Catherine Mueller decided to stay in the Dakota Territory rather than continue to Oregon, accepting Thomas's offer to establish her own homestead on a section of ranch land. The Peterson family continued their journey west, but not before Nils Peterson had spent weeks working alongside Thomas to repair winter damage to the ranch buildings. Payment for the hospitality they had received. As the last of the winter guests departed, Marlena found herself pregnant again. The news brought joy mixed with practical concerns. Samuel was not yet walking steadily. The ranch required enormous amounts of work during spring and summer, and Marlena had committed to serving as midwife for several women in the territory who were expecting babies later in the year. Thomas's reaction to the pregnancy news was pure delight. "Samuel needs a sibling," he declared, "and I can't wait to experience this from the beginning, knowing from the start that this child will be ours." The pregnancy proceeded smoothly, aided by Marlena's improved health and the excellent medical care available through Maria Santos and the connections Marlena had made with other women throughout the territory. She continued her midwifery studies and even attended 2 births during her second trimester, building a reputation as someone who could handle difficult deliveries with calm competence. But it was during her 7th month that the most significant challenge arose. Jeremiah Walsh appeared at the ranch again, this time alone and looking considerably aged by 2 years of estrangement from his daughter. He had come not to demand her return, but to ask for forgiveness and reconciliation. "I have been wrong," he told Marlena, his voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. About you, about Samuel, about what truly matters in life." Marlena listened as her father explained how the loneliness and community judgment had gradually worn down his pride. He had watched other families in Cedar Falls celebrate their grandchildren while he denied himself the joy of knowing Samuel. He had seen Thomas's reputation in the community grow rather than suffer because of his marriage to Marlena, forcing Jeremiah to confront his own prejudices and mistakes. "I want to know my grandson," he said simply. "And I want to know the daughter who was strong enough to survive everything I put her through." The reconciliation was not immediate or easy. Samuel, now walking and beginning to talk, was shy around this stranger who claimed to be his grandfather. Thomas remained politely distant, protective of Marlena's emotional well-being during her pregnancy. Maria Santos watched Jeremiah with the suspicious eyes of someone who had witnessed the damage caused by his earlier rejection. But Marlena, perhaps because of her own growth and healing, was willing to give her father a chance to prove his sincerity. She allowed him to visit regularly, to bring small gifts for Samuel, and to help with simple ranch tasks that demonstrated his genuine desire to be part of their lives. The test of Jeremiah's commitment came when Marlena went into labor with her second child. She had planned for Thomas and Maria to assist with the birth, but complications arose that required additional help. Jeremiah found himself holding Samuel and trying to keep the toddler calm while his daughter labored to bring his second grandchild into the world. When baby Rebecca Brennan was finally born healthy, loud, and clearly determined to make her presence known, Jeremiah was the first person besides Thomas and Maria to hold her. The sight of his grandfather cradling his new sister seemed to reassure Samuel, who suddenly decided that this new person might be acceptable after all. "She's beautiful," Jeremiah whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Just like her mother was at this age." The birth of Rebecca marked the completion of Marlena's transformation from desperate teenager to confident woman and mother. She had survived abandonment, isolation, and social censure to create a family built on love rather than obligation. She had developed skills and knowledge that allowed her to help other women through similar challenges. Most importantly, she had learned to trust her own judgment and strength while remaining open to love and support from others. As autumn arrived once again, Marlena established the Dakota Territory's first official midwifery practice, operating out of a room Thomas had built onto the ranch house specifically for her work. Women traveled from hundreds of miles away to benefit from her expertise and compassionate care. The ranch became known not just for its hospitality to travelers, but as a place where women could receive the best possible care during childbirth. The irony was not lost on anyone that the girl, who had once been cast out of respectable society, for her pregnancy had become the most trusted person in the territory when it came to helping other women through this same experience. Marlena's past, rather than being something to hide or overcome, had become the foundation for a calling that brought hope and safety to countless families. Samuel, now 2 years old, seemed to understand that his mother's work was important. He would play quietly during consultations, carefully staying out of the way, but always ready with a smile for nervous, expectant mothers. Rebecca, at 6 months, was already showing signs of her mother's determination and her father's gentle nature. Thomas often marveled at the changes the past 3 years had brought to his life. The quiet, orderly ranch that had been his refuge from grief had become a bustling center of community life, filled with the sounds of children, the conversations of women seeking help, and the constant activity of a family that had grown far beyond what he had ever imagined possible. As winter approached again, Marlena stood in the cave that had once been her desperate refuge, now accompanied by her husband, her children, and her father. The limestone chambers that had sheltered her during her darkest hours now served as a reminder of how completely her life had been transformed. "I used to think this place represented my failure," she told Thomas as Samuel chased echoes through the larger chamber and Rebecca dozed in her grandfather's arms. "Now I realize it represents my strength. Everything good in my life grew from the determination I found in these caves." The sound of Samuel's laughter bouncing off the ancient walls seemed to bless the observation. This place that had once echoed with the cries of a frightened girl now rang with the joy of a family that had been forged in adversity and strengthened by love. As they walked back toward the ranch house, where Maria had promised to have dinner, waiting, Marlena reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperation to fulfillment. The path had been longer and more difficult than she could have imagined, but it had led her to a life richer and more meaningful than any she had dared to dream. 5 years had passed since Marlena first took shelter in the limestone caves, and the Dakota Territory was changing as rapidly as her own life had transformed. The railroad had reached Cedar Falls, bringing new settlers, new opportunities, and new challenges that would test everything the Brennan family had built together. Arrival of the railroad meant that Marlena's reputation as a skilled midwife had spread far beyond the local territory. Letters began arriving from as far away as Chicago and Denver, written by doctors and medical schools who had heard about her innovative techniques and remarkable success rate. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the few female physicians in the country, traveled from Boston specifically to observe Marlena's methods and invited her to present her findings at a medical conference. "What you've developed here isn't just frontier medicine," Dr. Hartwell explained during her week-long visit. "You've pioneered approaches that could revolutionize childbirth care across the country. Your emphasis on emotional support, your pain management techniques, your infection prevention methods, they're ahead of anything being taught in medical schools." The recognition was gratifying, but it also presented Marlena with choices she had never expected to face. Medical schools were offering her scholarships to complete formal training. Hospitals in major cities wanted to hire her to establish maternity wards. Publishers were interested in a book about her experiences and methods. Thomas encouraged her to consider every opportunity. "You've built something extraordinary here," he told her as they discussed Dr. Hartwell's proposals. "Whatever you decide to do with that knowledge, I'll support you completely." But Marlena found herself torn between ambition and contentment. The life she had created on the ranch fulfilled her in ways she had never imagined possible. Samuel, now 5 years old, was thriving under Thomas's patient guidance. showing an early aptitude for working with animals and a natural kindness that made him beloved by everyone who met him. 3-year-old Rebecca had inherited her mother's determination and her grandfather's sharp business sense, already showing signs that she would be a force to be reckoned with as she grew older. The decision became more complicated when Marlena discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. At 23, she was still young enough for childbearing, but the demands of her midwifery practice had grown so extensive that she was traveling throughout the territory almost constantly. A 3rd child would require difficult choices about how to balance her professional calling with her responsibilities as a mother. The pregnancy also coincided with a crisis that threatened to destroy everything the family had built. A severe drought had struck the territory, lasting through what should have been the growing season and continuing into autumn. Cattle were dying, crops were failing, and many of the smaller homesteads were being abandoned as families gave up their dreams of frontier success. The Brennan Ranch, with its deep wells and creek access, was better positioned than most to survive the drought. But Thomas made the decision to use their resources to help struggling neighbors, providing water for livestock and offering grazing rights to families whose land had become unusable. The generosity strained their own resources and put the ranch's long-term financial stability at risk. "We can survive this," Thomas told Marlena as they reviewed their dwindling accounts. "But it means giving up some of our plans. The new barn will have to wait. The additional cattle purchase is impossible, and if the drought continues into next year." He didn't finish the sentence, but both of them understood the implications. They might lose the ranch that had become their sanctuary and the foundation of their family's happiness. The crisis deepened when Jeremiah Walsh's bank began foreclosing on homesteads throughout the territory. The drought had made it impossible for many settlers to make their loan payments, and bank regulations required Jeremiah to seize properties as collateral. The irony was bitter. The man who had rejected his daughter for her moral failures was now forced to destroy the dreams of dozens of families simply to keep his business solvent. The foreclosures created a humanitarian disaster that fell squarely into Marlena's area of expertise. Families who lost their homesteads often had nowhere to go, and pregnant women faced the terrifying prospect of giving birth without shelter or medical care. Marlena found herself not only delivering babies, but also organizing relief efforts, coordinating temporary housing, and fighting to keep families together during the crisis. The most heartbreaking case was the Kowalski family, Polish immigrants, who had invested everything in a small farm that had been completely destroyed by the drought. Anna Kowalski was 8 months pregnant with her 4th child when the foreclosure notice arrived, and her husband Jan had already left to seek work in the railroad camps, leaving her alone with 3 young children and no resources. Marlena discovered the family camping in the woods near their former homestead, trying to survive on wild berries and the charity of neighbors who had little to spare themselves. Anna was showing signs of premature labor brought on by stress and malnutrition, and her children were clearly suffering from exposure and inadequate food. Without hesitation, Marlena brought the entire Kowalski family to the ranch, despite the strain this placed on their own resources. The main house was already crowded with their own growing family and the constant stream of patients seeking Marlena's care. Adding 4 more people meant everyone would have less food, less space, and less privacy. But the crisis also revealed the strength of the community Marlena and Thomas had helped to build over the years. Catherine Mueller, now well established on her own homestead, arrived with wagon loads of preserved food. Ranch hands from neighboring spreads volunteered their time to help with the increased workload. Women throughout the territory organized a network to provide clothing, supplies, and temporary shelter for displaced families. Anna Kowalski's baby was born during a fierce autumn storm, delivered safely in the same bedroom where Rebecca had entered the world. The birth went smoothly despite Anna's weakened condition, and baby Martin Kowalski became the symbol of hope for families struggling to rebuild their lives after the drought. The experience of managing such extensive relief efforts while dealing with her own pregnancy taught Marlena new lessons about leadership and community organizing. She realized that her skills extended far beyond medical care into areas of social reform and humanitarian work that had barely existed on the frontier before her efforts created them. "You're not just a midwife anymore," Thomas observed as he watched her coordinate supply deliveries and assign temporary housing for refugee families. "You're building institutions that will outlast all of us." The recognition led Marlena to a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of accepting offers to train in established medical schools or work in big city hospitals, she decided to create her own institution, the Dakota Territory Women's Medical Institute, designed to train frontier women in midwifery, basic medical care, and community health organizing. The school would be based at the ranch, using the network of guest rooms and outbuildings that had evolved to accommodate the constant stream of visitors seeking Marlena's help. Students would learn through hands-on experience while contributing to the ongoing care of women throughout the territory. Graduates would return to their own communities with skills that could save lives and knowledge of how to organize effective relief efforts during future crises. Dr. Hartwell enthusiastically endorsed the plan, offering to help design curriculum and recruit the first class of students. Medical supply companies agreed to provide equipment at cost. Most importantly, the territorial government offered official recognition and funding, making the institute a legitimate educational institution rather than just an informal apprenticeship program. The third Brennan child, David, was born in the spring as construction began on the institute's first dedicated classroom building. His birth was attended by 3 of Marlena's first official students, women from across the territory, who had come to learn her methods and carry them back to their own communities. David's arrival completed the family in ways that felt both natural and miraculous. Samuel, now 6, appointed himself chief protector of both his younger siblings, showing a maturity and kindness that made both Marlena and Thomas proud beyond words. Rebecca, at 4, demonstrated that she had inherited her mother's organizational skills by creating elaborate systems for caring for her baby brother and managing the household chaos that came with a busy family and a growing school. Jeremiah Walsh's role in the family had evolved into something none of them could have predicted during those early days of estrangement and reconciliation. The bank foreclosures had taken a tremendous emotional toll on him, forcing him to confront the human cost of strict financial policies. He began spending more time at the ranch, not just as a grandfather visiting his family, but as someone seeking redemption through service to the community he felt he had failed. He became the Institute's unofficial administrator, using his business skills to manage finances, coordinate with suppliers, and navigate the territorial bureaucracy required to maintain official recognition. His transformation from the stern banker who had cast out his pregnant daughter to the gentle grandfather who read bedtime stories and organized school supply deliveries was perhaps the most remarkable change of all. The Institute's first graduation ceremony took place on a brilliant autumn day, with 12 women receiving certificates that qualified them as frontier midwives and community health workers. The ceremony was attended by families from across the territory, many of whom had been helped by Marlena's work during the drought crisis or have benefited from the Institute's ongoing services. As Marlena watched her first class of graduates prepare to return to their communities, she felt a satisfaction deeper than any personal achievement could have provided. These women would carry her knowledge and methods to places she could never reach personally, multiplying her impact far beyond what any individual practitioner could accomplish. "You've created something that will continue growing long after you're gone," Thomas told her as they stood together watching the graduates say their farewells. "These women will teach others, who will teach others, until your influence reaches women you'll never meet in places you'll never visit." That evening, as the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet after the excitement of graduation day, Marlena walked once more to the cave that had been her first refuge. But this time she was not alone. Samuel and Rebecca accompanied her, old enough now to understand the significance of the place where their mother had found the strength to survive her darkest hours. "This is where it all began," she told them as they explored the limestone chambers by lantern light. "When I was not much older than Samuel is now, I had to choose between giving up and fighting for a better life. Everything we have now grew from that choice." Rebecca, practical even at 4, wanted to know if the cave was still usable as shelter. Samuel, more imaginative, was fascinated by the idea that his mother had lived like a pioneer explorer, surviving on her own in the wilderness. Both children seemed to understand that they were visiting a place of great importance, even if they couldn't fully grasp the magnitude of the journey that had brought their family together. As they walked back toward the ranch house, where Thomas was waiting with baby David and a warm fire, Marlena reflected on the extraordinary path that had led from desperate teenage pregnancy to respected medical innovator and educator. The transformation had required every ounce of strength she possessed, but it had also revealed capabilities she had never suspected she had. The ranch that had started as Thomas's quiet refuge had become the center of a network that touched lives throughout the territory and beyond. The Dakota Territory Women's Medical Institute was receiving applications from as far away as California, and Maine medical journals were publishing articles about the innovative techniques being developed on the frontier. Government officials were consulting with Marlena about public health policies for expanding territories. But despite all the recognition and expansion, the heart of everything remained the same: a commitment to helping women through their most vulnerable moments and ensuring that no one had to face those challenges alone. That mission, born from Marlena's own experience of abandonment and isolation, had grown into something far larger than any of them had imagined possible. But it had never lost its essential character of compassion and practical care. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning in 1895, bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Health. Marlena read it twice before fully comprehending its contents. She was being invited to Washington, D.C. to serve as a consultant for the newly formed National Maternal Health Commission. The federal government wanted her expertise in developing standards for childbirth care across all territories and states. The invitation represented recognition beyond anything Marlena had ever imagined, but it also presented the most difficult decision of her adult life. Accepting would mean leaving the Dakota Territory for an extended period, possibly permanently. The work would be important, establishing policies that could save thousands of lives, but it would take her away from the ranch, the institute, and the hands-on medical practice that had defined her identity for nearly a decade. Thomas found her that evening in the institute's library, surrounded by medical journals and policy documents, trying to understand the full scope of what Washington was asking her to undertake. David, now 6 months old, slept peacefully in a basket beside her chair while she worked by lamplight. "They want to change how the entire country approaches maternal care," she told him, holding up the official invitation. "Every hospital, every doctor, every midwife would follow standards based on what we've developed here." "It's an extraordinary opportunity," Thomas replied, though his voice carried undertones of concern. "Your methods could help women everywhere, not just on the frontier." "But it would mean leaving all of this." Marlena gestured around the library that had become the heart of the institute. "The students, the patients who depend on us, the community we've built. How can I abandon the work here for something theoretical in Washington?" The decision became more urgent when Dr. Hartwell arrived unexpectedly, having traveled from Boston specifically to encourage Marlena to accept the position. Over dinner with the entire family, she painted a compelling picture of the national impact such work could have. The maternal mortality rate in major cities is actually higher than what you've achieved here on the frontier, Dr. Hartwell explained. Urban hospitals are overcrowded, understaffed, and many still follow medical practices that are decades out of date. Your techniques, properly implemented, could save thousands of lives every year. Samuel, now 7 and precociously interested. In adult conversations, asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. If mother goes to Washington, who will help the babies here get born safely? Dr. Hartwell had an answer for that too. The Institute has trained 43 graduates over the past 2 years. They're already serving communities throughout the territory. The network is strong enough to continue without constant oversight. But Marlena knew that the work required more than just trained midwives. The Institute had become a center for innovation, constantly developing new techniques and solutions for the unique challenges of frontier medicine. It served as a refuge for women facing difficult situations, a training ground for future caregivers, and a research center pushing the boundaries of what was possible in maternal care. The complexity of the decision was compounded by changes in the territory itself. Statehood was approaching for Dakota, which would bring new regulations, new opportunities, and new challenges. The railroad had transformed Cedar Falls from a frontier town into a small city, complete with multiple doctors, a proper hospital, and social services that hadn't existed when Marlena first arrived at the ranch. Catherine Mueller, who had become one of Marlena's closest advisors and the Institute's assistant director, offered a perspective that surprised everyone. During a private conversation, she suggested that Marlena's reluctance to leave might be based more on fear than on genuine concern for the Institute's future. "You've spent so many years building this sanctuary," Catherine observed. "But maybe it's time to trust that what you've built is strong enough to continue growing without you always being here to guide it." The conversation forced Marlena to confront uncomfortable truths about her own motivations. The ranch and the Institute had indeed become her sanctuary, a place where she felt safe and valued after the traumatic rejection of her youth. Leaving, even temporarily, meant risking the security she had worked so hard to create, but it also meant the possibility of impact on a scale she had never imagined. The techniques she had developed in the limestone caves and perfected through years of frontier practice could potentially help women across the entire continent. The opportunity to shape national policy was both terrifying and exhilarating. The decision was ultimately made when a delegation of her former students arrived at the ranch unexpectedly. Led by Margaret Thompson, the Institute's first graduate, 12 women traveled from across the territory to make a collective appeal. "You taught us that our responsibility extends beyond our own communities," Margaret said, speaking for the group. "Now you have the chance to fulfill that same responsibility on a national level. We can carry on the work here. You're needed in Washington." Thomas added his voice to the chorus of encouragement. "I married a woman brave enough to survive alone, in caves, and strong enough to build an institution from nothing. I trust that same woman to succeed in Washington and find her way back to us when the work is done." Even Jeremiah Walsh, now 70 and serving as the Institute's treasurer, supported the decision. "I've seen what happens when good people refuse to take on larger responsibilities because they're comfortable with smaller ones," he said quietly. "Don't make the same mistake I did." The preparations for departure took months. Marlena needed to ensure that the Institute could function smoothly in her absence, that her current patients would receive proper care, and that her family could manage the separation. She also had to prepare herself mentally for the transition from frontier medicine to the political complexities of federal bureaucracy. Dr. Hartwell arranged for Marlena to spend 2 weeks in Boston before heading to Washington, learning about urban medical practices and meeting with other physicians who would be involved in the National Commission. The experience was both enlightening and shocking. Urban hospitals were indeed as problematic as Dr. Hartwell had described, with mortality rates that would have been considered scandalous on the frontier. "You're not just bringing medical expertise to Washington," Dr. Hartwell told her after a particularly disturbing visit to a Boston maternity ward. "You're bringing a completely different philosophy about how to care for women during childbirth. The urban medical establishment has forgotten that birth is a natural process that usually goes well if you don't interfere too much." The journey to Washington in early 1896 was Marlena's first time traveling beyond the regional territories. The train ride took her through landscapes and cities that she had only read about, providing perspective on how vast and diverse the country had become. The frontier territories that had seemed like the center of the world were actually just one small part of a much larger and more complex nation. Washington, D.C. overwhelmed her initially. The scale of the federal buildings, the complexity of the political processes, and the sheer number of people involved in every decision created a work environment unlike anything she had experienced. The National Maternal Health Commission included doctors from major universities, hospital administrators from across the country, and government officials who had never witnessed a birth but wielded enormous power over policies that would affect millions of women. But Marlena's frontier experience had prepared her for challenges in ways she hadn't anticipated. The same practical problem-solving skills that had helped her survive in the caves served her well in navigating bureaucratic obstacles. The confidence she had gained from successfully treating difficult medical cases translated into authority when presenting her ideas to skeptical colleagues. Most importantly, her direct experience with the consequences of poor maternal care gave her moral authority that no amount of academic training could provide. Her first major presentation to the full commission was a turning point. Instead of delivering a theoretical lecture about medical procedures, Marlena told the stories of specific women she had helped: Anna Kowalski giving birth during the drought crisis, Catherine Mueller delivering her youngest child during a blizzard, the countless frontier wives who had faced childbirth without any medical support at all. "Gentlemen," she concluded, addressing the predominantly male commission, "you are developing policies that will affect the most important moment in millions of families' lives. Every regulation you create, every standard you establish, will determine whether mothers and babies live or die. This is not an academic exercise. These are real women with real families who deserve the best care we can provide." The presentation changed the entire tone of the Commission's work. Instead of focusing primarily on institutional concerns and professional jurisdictions, the discussions began centering on patient outcomes and practical effectiveness. Marlena's influence was particularly evident in the development of standards for rural and frontier areas, where her experience was unmatched by any other commission member. Meanwhile, letters from home kept her connected to the ongoing life of the ranch and the institute. Samuel was excelling in his studies and had begun helping Thomas with more complex ranch management tasks. Rebecca had started school in Cedar Falls but continued to spend afternoons at the institute, showing early signs of interest in following her mother's medical career. David was walking and talking, charming everyone who met him with his sunny disposition and obvious intelligence. Thomas's letters were filled with pride in her accomplishments and detailed updates about the Institute's activities. 3 new classes of students had begun their training, and the Institute had been asked to provide consultation for medical schools as far away as California and New York. The work was continuing to expand even without her direct oversight, proving that the foundation she had built was indeed strong enough to support continued growth. But the most meaningful correspondence came from her former patients and students. Women throughout the territory wrote to tell her about successful births, healthy babies, and community health improvements that could be traced directly to the training and methods she had developed. The network of care she had created was reaching 3rd generation. Beneficiaries, daughters of women she had trained, were now helping to deliver the babies of women whose mothers had been her patients years earlier. After 8 months in Washington, Marlena had successfully shepherded through Congress the most comprehensive maternal health legislation in American history. The new laws established minimum standards for childbirth care, created funding for midwifery training programs, and required hospitals to demonstrate competency in maternal care before receiving federal support. The legislation also included provisions for frontier medicine that recognized the unique challenges and solutions that Marlena had developed in the Dakota Territory. The work was important and satisfying, but Marlena found herself increasingly homesick for the landscape, the people, and the direct medical practice that had shaped her identity. Washington had given her the opportunity to impact policy on a national scale, but it had also reminded her that her greatest satisfaction came from the hands-on work of helping individual women and families through their most crucial moments. The decision to return to Dakota was made easier when the territorial governor offered her a new position, Director of Territorial Health Services, a role that would combine policy work with direct medical practice and allow her to continue expanding the institute, while also serving the broader region's healthcare needs. As her train pulled into Cedar Falls in late autumn of 1896, Marlena felt a profound sense of homecoming. The station platform was crowded with familiar faces, Thomas holding David, Samuel and Rebecca competing to be first to reach her, Catherine and Margaret representing the institute, and even her father waiting with barely contained emotion to welcome her back. But the most meaningful welcome came from a young woman she didn't recognize at first, Sarah Peterson, the daughter of Nils and Astrid Peterson, now 16, and wearing the distinctive blue dress that identified her as one of the Institute's advanced students. "Mrs. Brennan," Sarah said formally, "I'm here representing all the women you've helped. We want you to know that your work in Washington has already started making a difference. The new funding means we can expand our services to reach women we've never been able to help before." As Marlena looked around at the assembled crowd, her family, her students, her colleagues, and members of the community she had served for nearly a decade, she realized that her greatest achievement wasn't the national legislation or the recognition from Washington. It was the network of relationships and the culture of caring that had grown from her determination to survive in those limestone caves all those years ago. The new century arrived with unprecedented challenges that would test every lesson Marlena had learned about resilience, leadership, and the power of community. The Spanish-American War had ended, but its aftermath brought waves of veterans and displaced families to the Dakota Territory, many carrying diseases and traumas that stretched the region's medical resources beyond their limits. As Director of Territorial Health Services, Marlena found herself coordinating responses to medical crises that dwarfed anything she had previously encountered. A typhoid outbreak in the veteran settlement camps required quarantine procedures and mass treatment protocols that had never been attempted in the territory. Influenza swept through the Native American reservations where federal medical support was virtually non-existent. Meanwhile, the continuing influx of immigrants brought new challenges as families arrived speaking languages no one in the territory could understand, carrying medical traditions that sometimes conflicted with modern practices. The scope of the work required Marlena to develop new approaches to public health that went far beyond her original focus on maternal care. She found herself training teams of medical workers, establishing emergency hospitals, and negotiating with federal officials who often had no understanding of frontier conditions. The Institute had to rapidly expand to meet the demand for trained healthcare providers, growing from a small midwifery school to a comprehensive medical training center. But it was during the typhoid crisis that Marlena faced her greatest personal and professional challenge. Samuel, now 11 and increasingly involved in ranch work, contracted the disease while helping to distribute supplies to the quarantine camps. Despite having access to the best medical care available in the territory, his condition deteriorated rapidly. For 2 weeks, Marlena maintained a bedside vigil while continuing to coordinate the territorial health response. Thomas took over most of her administrative duties while she focused on nursing their son, using every technique she had learned over years of treating difficult cases. Rebecca, now 8, proved surprisingly capable of helping with Samuel's care, following her mother's instructions with the precision of a trained assistant. The crisis revealed depths of community support that humbled Marlena. Catherine Mueller arrived with supplies and took over the Institute's daily operations without being asked. Former students traveled from across the territory to offer assistance, creating a network of skilled help that allowed Marlena to focus entirely on Samuel's recovery. Even Jeremiah Walsh, now in his 70s, insisted on helping with David's care so that Thomas could support Marlena during the most difficult period. Samuel's recovery was slow but complete, and the experience taught the entire family important lessons about the fragility of life and the strength that could be found in community support. For Samuel himself, the illness marked a turning point in his understanding of his mother's work and his own future aspirations. He began expressing interest in studying medicine, inspired by witnessing the dedication and skill of the medical workers who had helped save his life. The typhoid outbreak also led to Marlena's next major innovation, the development of comprehensive public health protocols that could be implemented rapidly during medical emergencies. Working with a team that included doctors from the new state university, military medical officers, and her own institute graduates, she created standardized procedures for disease containment, resource distribution, and interagency coordination that would later be adopted throughout the Western states. But success in public health work came at a personal cost that Marlena hadn't anticipated. The constant travel, the long hours, and the emotional weight of coordinating responses to multiple simultaneous crises left her exhausted in ways that purely medical work had never done. She began to question whether the expansion of her responsibilities was taking her away from the direct patient care that had always been her greatest source of satisfaction. The dilemma deepened when she discovered she was pregnant for the 4th time. At age 29, the pregnancy was unexpected and complicated by her heavy work schedule and the stress of managing territorial health crises. For the first time since David's birth, Marlena found herself worried about her ability to balance motherhood with professional responsibilities. Thomas was characteristically supportive but also concerned about the toll that Marlena's expanded role was taking on her health and their family life. "You've proven that you can handle anything," he told her during one of their evening walks around the ranch. "But maybe it's time to ask whether you should be handling everything." The conversation led to a difficult reassessment of priorities and goals. Marlena realized that her success in creating systems and training others meant that she could begin delegating more responsibility without abandoning her commitment to improving medical care. The Institute now had a dozen faculty members, all former students who had returned to teach after gaining experience in their own communities. The Territorial Health Department had developed a competent staff of administrators and field workers who could handle routine operations. Most importantly, the network of trained midwives and community health workers throughout the region had reached a level of competency and coordination that made constant central oversight less necessary. The infrastructure she had built was strong enough to function effectively even if she stepped back from day-to-day management. The decision to reduce her official responsibilities was made easier by an unexpected development in national politics. The success of the maternal health legislation that Marlena had helped develop in Washington had inspired similar efforts in other countries, and she received an invitation from the International Red Cross to help establish maternal care standards for humanitarian operations worldwide. The opportunity was both thrilling and daunting. International work would mean even more travel and longer periods away from home, but it would also represent the ultimate expansion of the mission that had begun in the limestone caves, ensuring that no woman anywhere had to face childbirth without proper support and care. After extensive family discussions, They developed a compromise solution. Marlena would accept a consulting role with the International Red Cross that would require only periodic travel, while stepping back from her daily administrative duties in the Territorial Health Department. She would return to focusing primarily on the Institute and direct patient care, the work that had always brought her the greatest satisfaction. The transition coincided with another significant change in their family circumstances. Rebecca, now 9, had been accepted into an advanced educational program in Minneapolis that would prepare her for eventual admission to medical school. The opportunity was extraordinary for a girl her age, but it would mean leaving home for most of the year. Rebecca's departure forced the family to confront how much their children had grown and changed. Samuel was becoming a capable young man who could handle significant ranch responsibilities. David, at 4, was already showing signs of the intelligence and determination that characterized both his parents. The tight-knit family unit that had sustained them through so many challenges was evolving into something more complex as the children developed their own interests and aspirations. But change also brought new forms of closeness. Samuel's interest in medicine led to long conversations with Marlena about her work and experiences. David's natural curiosity made him an enthusiastic companion for Thomas during ranch work. Even Rebecca's absence seemed to strengthen their appreciation for the time they did spend together during school breaks and holidays. The fourth Brennan child, Elizabeth, was born during a gentle spring rain that seemed to bless her arrival. The birth was attended by 3 generations of the Institute's graduates, representing the evolution of midwifery training from Marlena's original informal apprenticeships to the sophisticated medical education program that now attracted students from across the continent. Elizabeth's birth also marked a personal milestone for Marlena. It was the first time she had experienced childbirth, with complete confidence in her support system and no anxiety about the future. The scared teenager who had given birth alone in Thomas's pasture had been replaced by a woman who could trust in her own knowledge, her husband's love, and the network of skilled caregivers she had spent years training. The Red Cross consulting work proved to be different from anything Marlena had done previously. Instead of developing new techniques or training individual caregivers, she found herself working on systematic approaches to maternal care in refugee situations, disaster zones, and areas affected by military conflict. The work required her to adapt her frontier experience to radically different cultural and logistical contexts. Her first international assignment took her to the Philippines, where the American colonial administration was struggling to provide medical care for a population recovering from war and disease. The tropical climate, unfamiliar diseases, and complex political situation created challenges unlike anything she had encountered in the Dakota Territory. But the fundamental problems were surprisingly familiar. Women were giving birth without proper medical support, infant mortality rates were catastrophically high, and local communities lacked the resources and knowledge needed to improve conditions on their own. The solutions required the same combination of practical medical skills, community organizing, and cultural sensitivity that Marlena had developed during her frontier years, working with Filipino midwives and Spanish colonial medical officers. Marlena helped establish training programs that combined traditional local practices with modern medical knowledge. The approach was more collaborative than anything she had attempted previously, requiring her to learn from indigenous medical traditions while sharing her own expertise. The experience also provided perspective on how much the Dakota Territory had changed during her years there. The frontier conditions that had once made medical care so challenging were rapidly disappearing, replaced by modern hospitals, trained doctors, and reliable supply chains. The Institute's focus was shifting from basic survival skills to advanced medical techniques and specialized care. When Marlena returned from the Philippines after 3 months abroad, she found that her family and community had adapted well to her absence. Samuel had taken on even greater responsibility for ranch operations, working alongside Thomas as a full partner rather than just a helper. David had started school and was excelling academically, showing particular aptitude for mathematics and science. Even baby Elizabeth seemed to have thrived under the care of Thomas and the Institute's staff, but the separation had also clarified what mattered most to Marlena. The international work was important and professionally satisfying, but it couldn't replace the deep connections she had built with her community, her students, and her patients over more than a decade of shared experiences. The limestone caves that had once been her refuge remained a symbol of the rootedness that gave her work its meaning and power. As 1902 arrived, Marlena made the decision to limit her Red Cross work to domestic assignments that would allow her to remain based in the Dakota Territory. The Institute had become too important, both to her personally and to the region's healthcare system, to risk undermining through extended absences. The decision proved prescient when a new crisis tested every system she had built. A massive prairie fire, driven by unprecedented drought and high winds, swept across 3 counties, destroying homesteads, killing livestock, and displacing hundreds of families. The disaster created immediate medical needs as people suffered from burns, smoke inhalation, and injuries sustained while fighting the fires or evacuating their properties. But the fire also created longer-term challenges as families lost not just their homes, but also their livelihoods. Pregnant women who had lost everything needed not just medical care, but also emotional support, temporary housing, and assistance planning for their children's futures. The situation required exactly the kind of comprehensive, community-based response that Marlena had been developing throughout her career. The fire response became a defining moment for the Institute and the broader network of health workers Marlena had trained. Working with military units, Red Cross volunteers, and local community organizations, her teams established field hospitals, organized evacuation procedures for vulnerable patients, and provided ongoing care for families living in temporary shelters. Most importantly, the response demonstrated how completely the culture of community-based healthcare had taken root throughout the region. Local communities that had never worked together before collaborated seamlessly because their health workers had been trained in the same systems and shared the same values of comprehensive care and mutual support. As Marlena stood in the Institute's expanded facilities, watching her students and graduates coordinate relief efforts that would have been impossible just a few years earlier, she realized that her greatest achievement wasn't any individual innovation or policy success. It was the transformation of an entire region's approach to healthcare, creating a culture where taking care of each other was seen as both a professional responsibility and a fundamental community value. The year 1905 brought news that would forever change the trajectory of Marlena's life and work. The Nobel Committee in Stockholm had established a new category for contributions to medicine and physiology, and Marlena Brennan had been nominated for her revolutionary approaches to maternal health care and community medicine. The nomination came from an international coalition of physicians who had studied her methods and witnessed their implementation across multiple continents. The letter arrived on a crisp November morning while Marlena was conducting her weekly rounds at the Institute. Dr. Clara Anderson, the committee's representative, had traveled from Sweden specifically to observe Marlena's work firsthand and conduct the formal evaluation required for Nobel consideration. "Mrs. Brennan," Dr. Anderson said as she watched Marlena demonstrate a new technique for managing difficult births, "your innovations have reduced maternal mortality rates by more than 60% in regions where they've been properly implemented. But what makes your work truly remarkable is how you've created sustainable systems that continue improving outcomes long after your direct involvement ends." The evaluation process required Marlena to document and present her methods in ways she had never attempted before. Working with Samuel, now 15, and preparing for university study, She began compiling comprehensive records of her techniques, training protocols, and outcome statistics spanning nearly 2 decades of frontier medicine. The documentation process revealed the extraordinary scope of what had been accomplished. The Institute had trained over 300 midwives and community health workers who were now serving communities from Alaska to Mexico. The maternal health legislation she had helped develop in Washington had been adopted by 12 states and was being studied by medical authorities in Europe and Asia. Most remarkably, regions where her graduates worked had consistently achieved maternal and infant mortality rates that were significantly lower than those in major urban centers with supposedly superior medical facilities. But the Nobel nomination also forced Marlene to confront aspects of her legacy that she had never fully considered. Dr. Anderson's interviews with former students revealed that many of them had adapted and improved upon Marlene's original methods, developing innovations of their own that were now being implemented in communities Marlene had never visited. "You haven't just trained midwives," Dr. Anderson observed during one of their conversations. "You've created a movement. Your former students are now training the next generation, and they're bringing their own insights and improvements to the work. The knowledge is evolving and growing beyond anything any single individual could have developed alone." The observation was both gratifying and humbling. Marlene realized that her greatest success lay not in any specific technique or innovation, but in her ability to inspire others to care deeply about the work and to continue pushing the boundaries of what was possible in maternal health care. The Nobel evaluation coincided with significant changes in Marlene's family life. Rebecca had completed her preparatory studies and been accepted into the Johns Hopkins Medical School, becoming one of only 12 women in her class. Her acceptance represented not just personal achievement but also validation of the educational approach Marlene had developed, combining rigorous academic preparation with extensive hands-on medical experience. Samuel had decided to pursue veterinary medicine rather than human medicine, but his choice reflected the same commitment to healing and community service that characterized his mother's work. His decision to focus on large animal practice meant he would be serving the agricultural communities that formed the backbone of the regional economy, applying medical knowledge to solve practical problems that affected entire communities. David, now 7, was showing early signs of intellectual gifts that surprised even his accomplished family. His mathematical abilities were already beyond his grade level, and he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of scientific principles that suggested he might eventually surpass all of them in academic achievement. Elizabeth, at 3, was too young for academic assessment, but was already displaying the determination and leadership qualities that seemed to characterize all the Brennan children. She had appointed herself as the Institute's unofficial greeter, charming visitors with her confident personality and obvious intelligence. But it was Thomas who was experiencing the most significant transformation. At 48, he had evolved from a rancher who had generously opened his home to a desperate girl into one of the territory's most influential advocates for progressive agricultural and social policies. His success in supporting Marlene's career while maintaining his own professional identity had made him a model for other men struggling to adapt to changing roles for women in society. The Nobel Committee's final evaluation included interviews with Thomas about the practical challenges of maintaining a family while supporting a spouse whose work required extensive travel and irregular schedules. His responses apparently impressed the evaluators with their insight into the social changes necessary to enable women's full participation in professional life. Supporting Marlene's career has required me to develop skills and perspectives never expected to need, Thomas told Dr. Anderson during their interview. But it has also given me a front row seat to witness someone change the world. I wouldn't trade that experience for any conventional marriage. The Nobel Prize announcement came in December, delivered by telegram to the Institute while Marlene was assisting with a particularly difficult birth. The timing seemed appropriate. She learned of the world's highest recognition for her professional achievements while engaged in the hands-on medical work that remained the heart of her identity. The news created an international sensation. Marlene became the first American woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Medicine, and only the second woman to receive a Nobel Prize in any category. Newspapers across the United States and Europe carried stories about the frontier midwife who had revolutionized maternal health care, often focusing more on the dramatic circumstances of her early life than on the sophistication of her medical innovations. The publicity brought both opportunities and challenges. Medical schools across the world invited Marlene to lecture on her methods. Publishers competed to offer contracts for her autobiography. Government officials sought her consultation on public health policies. But the attention also brought criticism from medical establishment figures who questioned whether someone without formal medical school training deserved such recognition. The controversy actually strengthened support for Marlene's approach among progressive physicians who had grown frustrated with the rigid hierarchies and outdated practices that characterized much of academic medicine. Dr. William Osler, one of the most respected physicians in America, publicly defended the Nobel Committee's decision by pointing out that Marlene's practical results were more impressive than the theoretical achievements of most medical school professors. Mrs. Brennan has done what medical schools should be doing but often fail to accomplish, Dr. Osler wrote in the Journal of the American Medical Association. She has developed effective treatments, trained competent practitioners, and improved health outcomes for thousands of patients. That she accomplished this through practical experience rather than classroom study only demonstrates the limitations of our current educational system. The Nobel Prize ceremony in Stockholm became an international celebration of both Marlene's individual achievements and the broader movement toward evidence-based, community-centered healthcare that her work represented. The ceremony was attended by medical professionals from across Europe and America, many of whom had traveled specifically to meet the woman whose methods they had studied and implemented in their own practices. Marlene's acceptance speech focused not on her personal journey, but on the collaborative nature of medical progress and the importance of learning from patients and communities rather than simply imposing external solutions. She used her platform to advocate for increased support for rural and frontier healthcare, better training opportunities for women in medicine, and recognition of the valuable medical knowledge that existed in indigenous and traditional healing practices. The techniques that earned this recognition were not developed in isolation, she told the assembled dignitaries. They grew from the wisdom of countless women who shared their experiences, the insights of colleagues who challenged my assumptions, and the courage of patients who trusted me with their most precious moments. This prize honors not just one person's work, but a collaborative approach to medicine that values practical results over theoretical credentials. The speech was widely quoted and helped establish Marlene as an advocate for progressive medical education and healthcare policy. Upon returning to America, she found herself in demand as a speaker and consultant, with invitations coming from medical schools, government agencies, and international health organizations. But the most meaningful recognition came from the communities where her work had the greatest impact. The town of Cedar Falls declared a celebration day in her honor, with festivities that included testimonials from dozens of women whose lives had been saved by Marlene's care or that of her graduates. Former patients traveled from across the region to share stories of successful births, healthy children, and medical crises that had been resolved through the network of care Marlene had helped establish. The celebration also provided an opportunity for the community to honor others who had contributed to the region's transformation. Thomas was recognized for his role in supporting women's professional advancement. Jeremiah Walsh, now in his 80s, was acknowledged for his evolution from stern banker to community advocate. Catherine Mueller received recognition for her work in expanding educational opportunities for frontier children. Most touching was the tribute from Sarah Peterson, now a fully qualified physician working in Minneapolis, who had traveled home specifically to speak about Marlena's influence on her life and career. "Mrs. Brennan saved my mother's life when I was born," Sarah told the assembled crowd. "But more than that, she showed me that a woman could dedicate her life to healing others while still being a devoted wife and mother. Every patient I help, every student I teach, carries forward the example she set." The recognition and awards, while gratifying, also marked the beginning of a new phase in Marlena's career. At 37, she was young enough to make significant new contributions to medicine, but old enough to begin thinking about long-term legacy and succession planning. The Institute had grown beyond anything she had originally envisioned, and it was clear that its future would require leadership that could navigate the increasingly complex world of professional medical education and healthcare policy. The solution emerged when Rebecca graduated from Johns Hopkins and announced her intention to return to the Dakota Territory to work alongside her mother. Rebecca's formal medical education, combined with her childhood exposure to frontier medicine, positioned her perfectly to bridge the gap between traditional medical practice and the innovative approaches Marlena had developed. "I want to take what I learned in medical school and combine it with what I learned growing up here," Rebecca told her parents during a family planning session. "The Institute needs someone who can speak the language of academic medicine while maintaining the community-based values that make this work effective." The decision to begin transferring leadership to Rebecca represented both natural family succession and strategic planning for the Institute's continued evolution. Rebecca's generation of medical professionals would face challenges that Marlena's pioneering work had only begun to address: urban health problems, industrial medicine, infectious disease control, and the integration of scientific research with clinical practice. As 1906 began, Marlena found herself in the unusual position of being an internationally recognized expert whose greatest satisfaction still came from the direct practice of frontier medicine. The Nobel Prize had opened doors she had never imagined existed, but it had also confirmed her conviction that the most important medical work happened in the relationships between individual caregivers and the patients and communities they served. Limestone caves that had been her first refuge now served as a quiet retreat, where she could think about the future without the constant demands of correspondence, speaking engagements, and administrative responsibilities. During her visits to the caves, often accompanied by Elizabeth, who was fascinated by her mother's survival story, Marlena reflected on the extraordinary journey from desperate teenager to Nobel laureate. But what struck her most during these quiet moments was not the magnitude of the transformation, but its essential continuity. The same determination that had kept her alive during that terrible winter was still driving her work decades later. The same compassion that had motivated her to help other women through difficult births continued to guide her decisions about Institute policies and international consulting work. The caves reminded her that survival and success were not endpoints, but ongoing processes that required constant adaptation, learning, and commitment to values that transcended individual achievement. The recognition was gratifying, but the work itself remained the source of her deepest satisfaction and strongest sense of purpose. The Great War that erupted in Europe in 1914 seemed impossibly distant from the peaceful valleys of Dakota, but its impact reached even the most remote frontier communities in ways no one had anticipated. The conflict created unprecedented demands for medical personnel, supplies, and expertise that would test everything Marlena and her network had built over the past quarter-century. The first indication of how the war would affect their work came when the Red Cross issued an urgent call for experienced medical personnel to serve in European field hospitals. The request specifically mentioned Marlena's innovations in emergency obstetric care and trauma treatment, skills that were desperately needed as civilian populations became targets of modern warfare. At 46, Marlena was older than most volunteers, but still physically capable of demanding field work. More importantly, she possessed a combination of surgical skill, leadership experience, and crisis management abilities that few other medical professionals could match. The decision to accept the Red Cross assignment was difficult, requiring extensive family discussions about the risks and benefits of overseas service. Rebecca, now 26 and fully established as the Institute's associate director, strongly supported her mother's decision to volunteer. "You've spent your entire career preparing for exactly this kind of challenge," she argued during one of their planning sessions. "The techniques you developed here could save thousands of lives in Europe. How can we keep that knowledge to ourselves when so many people need help?" Thomas was more conflicted about the deployment. At 57, he understood that Marlena's overseas service could last for years and might involve genuine physical danger. But he also recognized that preventing her from using her skills to help with such a massive humanitarian crisis would be both selfish and contrary to everything their marriage had represented. "I married a woman who was willing to risk everything to save her child's life," he reminded himself during one of their evening walks. "I can't ask her to become someone different now just because I'm worried about losing her." The children's reactions reflected their different ages and personalities. Samuel, now 24 and established as a veterinary practitioner, offered to manage ranch operations in his father's absence if Thomas decided to accompany Marlena overseas. David, at 16, was eager to contribute to the war effort and initially asked to postpone his college plans to join his mother as a medical volunteer. Elizabeth, now 12, simply announced that she intended to write letters to her mother every day and expected detailed responses, describing everything she was learning about European medicine. But it was Jeremiah Walsh, now 81 and increasingly frail, who provided the most unexpected perspective on Marlena's war service decision. During a quiet conversation in the Institute's library, he reflected on how completely his understanding of duty and sacrifice had been transformed by witnessing his daughter's career. "When you were 17 and pregnant, I thought the most important thing was protecting our family's reputation," he admitted. "I was so focused on what other people would think that I couldn't see the strength and courage that were already obvious in you. Now I understand that the most important thing is using whatever abilities we have to help other people, regardless of what anyone else thinks about our choices." The preparation for overseas deployment required months of intensive training and coordination. The Red Cross wanted Marlena to lead a team of experienced frontier medical workers who could establish field hospitals and train European personnel in advanced trauma care techniques. The team would include 3 of the Institute's senior graduates, 2 military medics who had worked with Marlena during previous crisis responses, and a supply specialist who understood the logistics of providing medical care in remote locations. Selection and training of the deployment team became an opportunity to showcase how completely the Institute's educational approach had evolved. The graduates who volunteered for war service possessed not only advanced medical skills, but also leadership abilities, cultural sensitivity, and adaptability that made them valuable in any challenging situation. Margaret Thompson, the Institute's first graduate and now a senior instructor, would serve as Marlena's deputy and eventual replacement if anything happened to the mission leader. Her 20 years of experience in frontier medicine had given her expertise in improvisation, resource management, and team coordination that would be essential in European field conditions. Catherine Muller's eldest daughter, Anne, had followed her mother into medical work and volunteered for the deployment, despite having 3 young children at home. Her decision represented the generational continuation of the values and commitments that had guided the Institute since its founding. as well as the practical reality that the war's demands required sacrifices from entire families. The most challenging aspect of the deployment preparation was adapting frontier medical techniques for European conditions. The Institute's methods had been developed for situations where resources were limited, transportation was difficult, and patients often had to travel long distances to receive care. But European field hospitals presented different challenges: massive numbers of casualties, sophisticated but overloaded medical infrastructure, and cultural barriers that didn't exist in American frontier communities. Working with military medical officers and Red Cross coordinators, Marlena's team developed modified protocols that could be implemented rapidly in field hospitals while still maintaining the patient-centered approach that had always characterized their work. The modifications included streamlined triage procedures, simplified surgical techniques that could be performed under battlefield conditions, and psychological support methods designed for patients traumatized by modern warfare. The journey to Europe in early 1915 was Marlena's first ocean crossing and her longest separation from family since the early days of her marriage. The Atlantic Passage provided time for final preparations and team bonding, but it also allowed for reflection on how drastically her life had changed since those desperate days in the limestone caves. The contrast was almost unimaginable. The frightened 17-year-old who had survived winter alone with her unborn child had become a Nobel laureate leading an international medical mission. The girl who had been cast out by her own father was now recognized as one of the world's leading authorities on emergency medical care. The transformation represented not just personal growth, but the evolution of an entire society's understanding of women's capabilities and contributions. France in 1915 was unlike anything in Marlena's experience. The scale of the destruction, the sophistication of the medical challenges, and the cultural complexity of working with international teams of doctors and nurses required every skill she had developed over 2 decades of frontier practice. But the fundamental problems were surprisingly familiar to many patients: too few resources and desperate need for practical solutions that could be implemented quickly under difficult conditions. The field hospital where Marlena's team was assigned was located near Verdun, one of the war's most brutal battlefields. The facility was treating not only military casualties, but also civilian refugees, many of whom were pregnant women and children who had been displaced by the fighting. The combination of military trauma medicine and civilian obstetric care was exactly the kind of complex challenge that Marlena's background had prepared her to handle. Within weeks of arrival, Marlena's team had implemented modifications to the hospital's procedures that dramatically improved both efficiency and patient outcomes. Their triage system, based on methods developed for frontier emergencies, enabled doctors to treat more patients more effectively. Their pain management techniques, originally designed for women in labor, proved remarkably effective for soldiers recovering from surgery. Most importantly, their emphasis on psychological support and family involvement in patient care brought a human dimension to medical treatment that had been largely absent from military medicine. But the most significant impact of Marlena's war service came from her work training European medical personnel in advanced obstetric techniques. The war had created unprecedented dangers for pregnant women, as nutrition shortages, stress, and displacement created conditions that dramatically increased the risks of childbirth. The medical techniques that Marlena had developed for frontier conditions proved remarkably effective for helping European women through pregnancy and delivery under wartime conditions. Working with French, Belgian, and British doctors, Marlena established training programs that could be rapidly implemented in hospitals throughout the war zone. The programs combined her practical techniques with European medical knowledge, creating hybrid approaches that were more effective than either tradition alone. Within months, hospitals across the region were reporting significant improvements in maternal and infant survival rates, Even under the extreme conditions created by ongoing warfare, the success of the training programs led to requests for Marlena's assistance from medical authorities throughout Europe. She found herself traveling from hospital to hospital, teaching her methods to doctors and nurses who would then train others in their own institutions. The knowledge was spreading through European medical networks even faster than it had expanded across American frontier communities, but the personal cost of war service was higher than Marlena had anticipated. The constant exposure to suffering, the relentless pressure of life and death decisions, and the separation from family began taking the toll that was both physical and emotional. Letters from home provided comfort and connection, but they also reminded her of all the ordinary family moments she was missing while serving overseas. The most difficult period came during the Battle of the Somme, when casualties overwhelmed every medical facility in the region. Marlena's team worked continuously for 6 days, performing surgeries, managing triage, and coordinating patient transport under conditions that pushed everyone beyond their limits. The experience demonstrated both the effectiveness of their training and the human cost of modern warfare. It was during this crisis that Marlena received news that would change her perspective on the entire war experience. Rebecca had been accepted for advanced surgical training at Harvard Medical School, making her one of the first women to pursue specialization in obstetric surgery. The opportunity represented the culmination of everything Marlena had worked to achieve: a daughter who could combine formal medical education with practical experience to advance the field even further. But Rebecca's letter also included troubling news from home. Thomas had been injured in a ranch accident and was recovering slowly. David had accelerated his academic program to begin medical school earlier than planned. Elizabeth was struggling with her mother's extended absence and had begun having difficulties in school. The family updates forced Marlena to confront the reality that her war service, however important internationally, was creating costs for the people she loved most. The question was whether the humanitarian benefits of her overseas work justified the personal sacrifices being made by her family and community. The decision was ultimately made by circumstances beyond her control. A German offensive in early 1917 forced the evacuation of several field hospitals, including the facility where Marlena's team had been working. During the evacuation, she was injured by shrapnel from an artillery shell, suffering wounds that required extensive treatment and a long recovery period. The injury was serious but not life-threatening, involving damage to her left shoulder and arm that would require months of rehabilitation. But it also provided a natural transition point for ending her war service and returning to the work that had always been her primary calling. The techniques her team had developed were now being used throughout European medical networks, and the training programs they had established could continue without her direct oversight. As Marlena recovered in a London hospital during the spring of 1917, she reflected on the extraordinary experience of applying frontier medical techniques to the most sophisticated conflict in human history. The war had demonstrated that the essential principles of medical care, compassion, competence, and commitment to saving lives remained constant regardless of the setting or circumstances. But the war had also shown her that her greatest contributions came not from her individual skills but from her ability to teach others and create systems that could continue functioning effectively without constant central control. The Institute in Dakota, the medical networks in Europe, and the policy frameworks in Washington all represented the same fundamental approach: empowering local practitioners with knowledge and support while maintaining high standards of care. Journey Home in late 1917 was both a homecoming and a transition to a new phase of her career. At 49, Marlena was still young enough for significant new contributions, but old enough to begin thinking seriously about legacy and succession. The war had demonstrated the international relevance of her work, but it had also confirmed that her deepest satisfactions came from the personal relationships and community connections that could only be maintained through consistent local presence. The autumn of 1925 brought Marlena's 60th birthday and an unexpected opportunity to witness the ultimate validation of everything she had built. The International Congress of Midwifery had chosen the Dakota Territory Women's Medical Institute as the site for their first American conference, bringing together practitioners from 43 countries to study the methods and systems that had evolved from those desperate days in the limestone caves. Standing before an audience of medical professionals from around the world, Marlena felt the profound weight of the journey that had brought her to this moment. The cave that had once sheltered a frightened pregnant teenager had become the birthplace of medical innovations now practiced on every continent. The network of care that began with a single rancher's kindness had grown into international movements that were saving thousands of lives each year. Rebecca, now 36 and the Institute's director, had organized the conference with a sophistication that demonstrated how completely the institution had evolved. The 3-day program included presentations on advanced surgical techniques, discussions of public health policy, and workshops on community organizing methods. But the most powerful session was the testimonial panel, where former patients and students shared stories of how the Institute's work had transformed their lives and communities. The testimonials revealed the true scope of Marlena's legacy. A woman from Alaska described how her remote community had achieved zero maternal mortality over 5 years through techniques learned from an Institute graduate. A doctor from Brazil explained how he had adapted Marlena's methods for treating indigenous populations in the Amazon rainforest. A midwife from Ireland told of establishing training programs that had revolutionized rural healthcare throughout her country. But perhaps the most moving testimony came from Samuel, now 39, and one of the region's most respected veterinarians. He spoke not as a medical professional, but as someone whose entire life had been shaped by witnessing his adoptive mother's dedication to healing and service. "My mother saved my life before I was even born," he told the assembled delegates. "But she also taught me that being saved creates an obligation to help save others. Every animal I treat, every farmer I help, every student I teach carries forward the example of compassion and competence that she set." David, now 27 and completing his residency in surgery, had traveled from Chicago specifically to attend the conference. His presentation on modern surgical techniques included detailed acknowledgments of how his mother's early innovations had influenced current medical practice. At 23, Elizabeth had just graduated from law school and was already working on legislation to expand healthcare access in rural communities. The conference also provided an opportunity to celebrate the broader network of relationships that had sustained Marlena throughout her extraordinary career. Thomas, now 68 but still vigorous, was honored for his role in supporting women's professional advancement. Catherine Mueller, 71 and still active in regional educational initiatives, received recognition for her decades of community organizing work. Most surprisingly, the conference featured a special tribute to Jeremiah Walsh, who had died the previous year at 88. His transformation from the stern banker who had cast out his pregnant daughter to the generous grandfather who had supported her revolutionary medical work had become a symbol of how individuals and communities could evolve beyond their prejudices and limitations. But the conference's most significant moment came when Marlena was asked to return to the limestone caves with a group of international visitors who wanted to see where her extraordinary journey had begun. Walking through the chambers that had sheltered her during that terrible winter 38 years earlier, she was struck by how much had changed and how much had remained constant. The cave itself was unchanged, the same limestone walls, the same underground spring, the same natural shelves where she had once stored her meager supplies. But the meaning of this space had been completely transformed. What had once represented desperation and isolation now symbolized resilience and hope. The place that had witnessed her lowest moment had become the foundation for achievements beyond anything she could have imagined. Standing in the main chamber with medical professionals from around the world, Marlena reflected on the extraordinary path that had led from teenage pregnancy to international recognition. But what struck her most was not the magnitude of the transformation, but the essential continuity of purpose that had guided every major decision. "I came to these caves because I had nowhere else to go," she told her international visitors. "But I survived here because I refused to give up on the possibility that life could be better for me, for my child, and eventually for other women facing similar challenges." Everything else that followed grew from that simple refusal to accept that difficult circumstances had to mean defeated dreams. The observation captured something essential about both Marlena's personal journey and the broader social transformations she had witnessed and helped create. The late 19th and early 20th centuries had been a time of unprecedented change, particularly for women's roles and opportunities. Marlena's career had both reflected and contributed to those changes, demonstrating that individual determination combined with community support could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As the conference concluded and international visitors departed, Marlena found herself facing questions about retirement and succession that she had been avoiding for several years. At 60, she was still physically and mentally capable of demanding medical work, but she was also aware that the Institute's future required leadership that could navigate challenges she had never faced. The solution emerged through family discussion and institutional planning that reflected the collaborative approach Marlena had always favored. Rebecca would assume full directorship of the Institute, while Marlena would continue in an emeritus role that allowed her to focus on the direct patient care that had always been her greatest source of satisfaction. Samuel would expand his veterinary practice to include public health work, addressing the intersection between animal and human health that was becoming increasingly important. David would eventually return to establish a surgical training program that could complement the Institute's midwifery focus. Elizabeth would work on legal and policy issues that could support healthcare access improvements. The succession planning represented more than just family arrangements. It symbolized the successful transition from pioneering individual effort to sustainable institutional development. The work that had begun with one desperate teenager's determination to survive had evolved into a multi-generational commitment to healing and service that could continue indefinitely. But even as she prepared for semi-retirement, Marlena continued to receive requests that demonstrated the ongoing relevance of her work. Medical schools wanted her to develop curricula for training rural practitioners. Government agencies sought her consultation on healthcare policies for underserved populations. International organizations invited her to help establish medical training programs in developing countries. The requests were gratifying, but Marlena had learned to be selective about commitments that would take her away from the community and family, relationships that remained her deepest source of satisfaction. The limestone caves had taught her that survival and success were ultimately about maintaining connections to place, to purpose, and to the people who made life meaningful. As winter approached in 1925, Marlena walked once more to the caves. That had been her first refuge, this time accompanied by her newest grandchild, Rebecca's 6-month-old daughter, named Marlena in honor of her grandmother. Holding the baby in the same chamber where she had once feared for her own child's survival, she marveled at the continuity that connected past struggles to present blessings. The frightened teenager, who had sought shelter in these limestone walls, could never have imagined the life that lay ahead, the loving marriage, the successful children, the professional recognition, the thousands of lives saved through her work. But that girl's determination to survive and her refusal to abandon hope had made everything else possible. As she walked back toward the ranch house where 3 generations of her family waited for dinner, Marlena reflected on the essential truth that had guided her entire journey. That individual courage, when combined with community support and sustained by love, could transform not just one life but entire networks of relationships and possibility. The cave remained behind her, empty but not forgotten, a testament to the power of human resilience and a reminder that even the darkest circumstances could become the foundation for extraordinary achievement. The light that had guided her through those desperate winter nights had grown into something that now illuminated communities across the world, proving that sometimes the territory's greatest transformations began with one person's refusal to give up hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.